With great power comes great responsibility.
Compromise where you can. Where you can't, don't. Even if everyone is telling you that something wrong is something right. Even if the whole world is telling you to move. It is your duty to plant yourself like a tree, look them in the eye and say no. You move.
Never step onto the battlefield of ideas unprepared. Before you enter the fray, you need a plan. And there's no better place to get one than right here on Tactics with host Caleb Colquitt. The Situation Room goes live now on News Radio 1440.
Good evening, everybody, and thank you so much for being with us here on Tactics, where speech isn't violence, tolerance isn't love, and disagreement isn't hate. Thank you for being on the program. Welcome in. As always, we're going to start out with our Alabama coronavirus update. And it's a weird thing because being a news person and being a personality like I am, you do have to keep up with the news. And right now that's kind of fortunate because I would probably be keeping up with it regardless. But it's odd that I continue to report on the same thing every single day. And it's kind of unfortunate this thing has just eaten up the entirety of the news cycle, and I understand why it has. I'm not saying that this is a problem, and I'm happy to bring the news to you, but here's the reason I bring this up. I realize it can get disheartening, and especially for the average person that isn't necessarily accustomed to watching the news all the time or always staying on top of things, and then watching really only at times like this where the bad news is just cascading you over you like some kind of tsunami. I get that it can get depressing. I get that it can get disheartening. And I just wanted to say to everybody, lean on people that you trust. Be around the people that you care about, and try to do the best that you can to not get bogged down by the negativity. Because I know it's part of my job. I got to bring the news, and right now a lot of the news is bad, and I get that. But I'm just saying that you need to take certain steps in your own life to be able to counteract that, and I think that a great place to start, and I'm not going to go through it right now because we've got to get to our update, but I think that a really great place to start would be looking at some of Christ's teachings from the Sermon on the Mount, specifically the ones that talk about anxiety and that God is always going to take care of us and that ultimately His will is going to work things out for us. Another great passage for that would be Romans 8, especially chapter 8, verse 28. And really that whole section of Scripture is just phenomenal for helping a person of faith sort of counteract the anxiety that is working in their lives. So just a quick public service announcement before we get into the meat and potatoes of what we're going to be talking about today. So let's go ahead and pull up our Alabama coronavirus update. You can see here from the Alabama Department of Health, we have 907 confirmed cases, which, I mean, that's pretty scary. Remember that we were under 500 last week and we're already almost up to 1,000. So that's something that's kind of terrifying, and I understand that. We have 6,531 tested, and right now 6 deaths, and you can see the map there where all of the, when we started this out, Jefferson County and Shelby County were significantly ahead of everybody else by wide margins, and that gap is closing, which it's not because Jefferson County and Shelby County aren't also very hard-hit areas. It's just that many, many other areas in the state are getting hit really hard right now. And you can also see that map is starting to fill up. There was a time when this map started out where there was a big, big chunk of the state, especially in the southern part, where you really weren't seeing a whole lot of counties. There were several counties that had 0 cases, and now there are very, very few that don't have some confirmed cases, and part of the reason that may be, that we'll talk about here in just a second, is that some of those counties don't actually have testing facilities, and so whether or not they're residents of those locations that they're being tested in may have may understand that, which basically means now that we're in the heat of this thing, that it's going to get to the point to where you've got a few cases scattered across even the more rural parts of the state, and we're getting to the point to where a lot of people were projecting we would be, that virtually everybody is dealing with this thing, that it's touching everybody at least to some degree or another. So let's look over the numbers and exactly what those numbers mean. So first of all, since we have 907 confirmed cases, that is a plus 390 since Thursday, when the last update was on our Thursday show. Now, that is something that will sound very alarming to people, and there's reason for concern, don't get me wrong, but it's actually a few less new cases than we had the day before on Wednesday when we did the update. And if you're looking at averaging that out, that's about 100 new cases, a little under 100 new cases a day if you average it for the past 4 days. So we're floating at about 97, 96 cases for a day. But remember that there was a big spike last week where we had plus 137 and plus 151 on 2 of those days. So actually our rate of new cases, just by the numbers, has actually dropped, which is something not to necessarily be thrilled about or think, hey, we're out of the woods now and this is all going to start going down. No, that's not what's happening. But I'm just saying that there is a bit of a positive spin here to take on this, because we were reporting 130 to 150 new cases a day. Now we're reporting on average a little less than 100. Now, granted, yesterday, again, that's an average, because if you look at the numbers yesterday, we actually had a fairly big spike on Sunday, which helped counteract some of the lesser increase in numbers that we had on Saturday and Friday. I'm not sure exactly why that is. I think it has to do with Sunday being about, I think a lot of people probably got tested on Friday and Saturday, and that's the reason that Sunday we had this big spike of people where you didn't have as many people getting tested on like Wednesday and Thursday. And so that's probably why Friday was a little calmer and so on and so forth. So I think that that's why we're seeing the numbers that we're seeing. But if this remains to be the case, if what happens is we continue to get roughly under 100 every day, we still haven't been that really big exponential spike that we've seen, for example, from South Korea, from Italy, from the nations that have been hit really hard from this. And that means that the things that we're doing are probably working. The things that we're doing have started to flatten that spike, because we've had multiple days now where we're averaging under 100 new cases per day, which means that it's not really growing all that much, at least in an upward direction. This is really good news. Again, it's something that's concerning. I get that. But relative to what it could be, and I know that this is hard to take, but relative to what it could be, it's actually not nearly as bad as you would think. Now, another thing to note with the 6,531 cases, that means that we're testing at about a 13% rate of people being tested having the coronavirus. Now, that's actually about the same as it was the last time that we looked, because you remember we were worried because that percentage was getting kind of high, but it looks like that is more or less stabilized, and it's rounded out to about 13% of the cases that we're testing having confirmed with the Wuhan virus. So actually, it would be better for that percentage to go higher if certain conditions are met. And the reason that I say that is, if we have a really high percentage of people testing positive, and we're doing that after we've had consistent good testing and aggressive testing where we're testing a lot of people, if that takes place, then that means the vast overwhelming majority of people that are being tested are people that need to be tested because there's a good chance that they have it. And so we're not wasting tests on people that don't need it. That's actually a good sign in a lot of ways. But again, like I said, that is contingent upon that other condition being met. And that condition being that we have very aggressive testing, and there's a lot of people that are getting tested, and the people that are symptomatic are the ones that are actually being tested. And that's something that it's impossible to know for sure, because you can't know what you don't know. And that whole thing is based on the idea of not testing, which would be, by definition, people we don't know if they have it or not. So I'm just saying that that's something to not be alarmed about, because if the testing rate actually goes higher, that doesn't mean that we're necessarily getting more cases. It means that the people that are getting tested are more likely to be the ones that actually need it. So even if that percentage were like at 100%, that wouldn't necessarily be a bad thing. For example, if the only person in the whole state of Alabama that actually needed to be tested, the only one that actually had the Wuhan flu, went in and got tested, and he tested positive, that would be a 100% rate of people being tested having the coronavirus. But if nobody else in the state of Alabama actually needed the test, then that's okay, because the only person that needed testing actually got it. So again, I get that we're dealing with an unknown X factor, and that's the reason that you can't know for sure whether or not that percentage is something that is good or bad. It's useful information, but ultimately it's not something to dwell on, which is the reason that I'm sort of trying to explain what exactly that means. So if we can keep that one up, and that only people that actually need testing are actually getting tested, that may very well actually be a positive thing. The fact that we are doing aggressive testing now is typically yielding results that are showing that this thing actually is helping suppress that spike. So we had 6 deaths, of course, confirmed with this thing, which is, of course, sad and tragic regardless of the circumstances surrounding them. But again, if we have 907 confirmed cases and only 6 confirmed deaths, that's an incredibly low death rate. And granted, we're going to need a lot more data on this, so I'm not saying that this means that the fatality rate is absolutely less than people were projecting it. But there were a lot of factors going into people projecting it being roughly 1 to 3%. And there was actually a recent study done by Stanford University, some doctors at their medical school, that they looked over the numbers, and they said that there is a very good chance that in other nations that have been dealing with the Wuhan flu, that a lot of the people, based on their understanding and their models, that were not getting tested were either asymptomatic or they had symptoms but were not getting tested at all, which means the fatality rate for this virus is actually significantly smaller than originally believed to be. Now, again, just like I was explaining with the percentage rate of people being tested, it's impossible to know what you don't know, because by definition, you don't know it. But if their model is correct and there really were this many people that were being infected that they just felt like it was a cold and got over it very quickly, well, that's actually something to celebrate, because that means a lot more people got the virus that we didn't know about and obviously didn't think it was serious enough to either be hospitalized or even go to a doctor and check it out, which means that fatality rate is significantly smaller than we had originally thought. So if that is the case, that's something that is promising. Again, we're going to need a lot more data on this. It's by no means conclusive, and it is based on an X factor that we can't possibly know. But these scientists, they do know what they're doing, and they've said that this is at least a possible explanation for the fatality rates that we're seeing. And so hopefully this winds up being much more bark than bite, I guess, would be the best way to say that. Now, let's go ahead and look at the testing facility. Speaking of aggressive testing and seeing how well the state of Alabama is doing on this, I want to check at the new testing sites that we have across the state. So this is a map of the new testing facilities, and as you can see, there has been a substantial increase in the number of testing facilities that can handle testing for the Kung flu. And they have filled in pretty much all of the gaps that I originally talked about. You still see a little bit of a gap there in the part north of Tuscaloosa, so that northwestern part, but still there's several locations that you could go to get tested within at least an hour drive. One other thing that I do find a little odd is that there is a bit of a blank spot around the Dothan area. So the nearest testing facility to Dothan is not Enterprise, but Troy and Andalusia, which again is odd. I do think it's a little strange that Dothan still doesn't have a testing facility, but that's still only about an hour to an hour and 20-minute drive, depending on traffic. I've made that drive many, many times before. And so realistically, I think based on the number of testing facilities that we have now, it's really not as big a deal. It would certainly be more convenient, and it would be better if we maybe had one in Dothan, maybe had one in one of the towns north of Tuscaloosa, and maybe, somewhere north of where Baldwin County is, but there's several testing facilities within a reasonable drive to get to any of the locations marked on that map. So I really don't think that it is going to significantly hinder somebody that wants to get tested who actually does believe themselves to be symptomatic. I think that actually the officials in Alabama should be commended for doing a good job, because you have to keep in mind, this thing is so incredibly new. The testing material and the ability to test is new. And anytime you implement anything new, and I'm not talking about the healthcare service specifically, I'm talking about just in general, there's a whole lot of working around things that goes into offering a new service. So since we're using healthcare in general, let's get specific on that. So if you are administering a new test for a new virus, you not only have to have the proper equipment, they needed these testing kits to go out to several different places so that they would be able to facilitate that, but you also need knowledge of the people of how to actually work it. So not only do you have to have the raw materials there, which especially right now where shipping and getting things delivered has been more difficult and more costly than normal, that becomes a hurdle to try to get over. But on top of that, you also have to consider that the staff and the people there had to implement it very quickly and get all of the healthcare professionals in those testing facilities knowledgeable enough about how to use the equipment properly, how to analyze the tests, so on and so forth. And so there's a lot of overhead that goes on with that I think that the people in Alabama should be commended for putting this together. The Alabama Department of Public Health, our lawmakers, Governor Ivey, and of course our very right now brave and we understand how necessary they are, our healthcare workers right now, and being able to do that and do it so quickly. Again, I'd love to see a couple more testing facilities, and I think that there's room for improvement, but dang, I mean, if you got to give them a letter grade on this, considering how fast this thing hit, and that I've only been in quarantine for 3 weeks, Alabama's really been working on this for the past 2, this is a pretty quick turnaround relative to other things. I mean, usually it would take much longer to roll something like this out. And so kudos to the state of Alabama and the people that are putting up these testing facilities for the virus. It seems like they've done a really, really good job in all of this. And since we're talking about things going on within the state of Alabama, and I think that it would really behoove us to have a pick-me-up story, here's some really good news. A company that is native to the state of Alabama, founded right here within the state of Alabama, Jack's. I'm sure that all of us are familiar with Jack's. I mean, even if you don't eat there or haven't eaten there before, surely you've seen some of them. This, restaurant is spread like wildfire all across the state of Alabama, and actually, I think for good reason, which I may talk about here in a second. They actually have started up a new program where they are helping raise money for charity for families that are impacted by this. In other words, families that have kids that have immunodeficiency disease or have other special considerations, maybe kids with asthma, that sort of thing. And this fund is supposed to help the families that are affected by this, that have extreme difficulty because of the virus. Because, yes, staying inside and having to homeschool, that's a difficulty, but it reaches a whole other level when you're talking about having someone in your family that is incredibly elderly and is at very high risk, or somebody that's a cancer patient, which is something that I know a little bit about, or if you've got, like I said, a kid with asthma or immunodeficiency or some kind of breathing disorder, all of a sudden that becomes a whole other level of having to deal with it. And this charity is supposed to specifically gather up money to help families in these situations. So they put together a short little 30-second clip, and just because I think it's something that could help, and also I wanted to give them a little free publicity for doing this, here it is for your viewing pleasure. This is the promo that they put together for their charity.
Here in the South, neighbor and family are just 2 words for the same thing. During this tough time, we want to help. Jack's Family Fund is providing grants to families, kids, and other groups with critical needs in the communities we call home. And for the next few weeks, you can partner with us by donating to the Jack's Family Fund with every order, at our drive-thru or online at eatatjacks.com/gives. Jack's, all about our neighbors and all about the South.
So personally, I really love this, and part of the reason is I do just genuinely love Jack's. But the fact that they are an Alabama-based business doing this, I wanted to give them kudos for that. And if you're somebody that now I've completely shut myself off and I'm in full quarantine, I'm not having any interaction with people in the outside world, if at all possible. I'm basically just holed up in my secret bunker. But there are a lot of people that, yes, they're quarantining and limiting their social interaction as much as possible, but they're still going out and getting things at drive-thrus, that sort of thing. That's where most people are right now. So if you are contemplating going and getting some food tonight from a drive-thru, might I suggest Jack's and maybe dropping off a donation for that. This is a time where I get that money is tight and we're all worried about some of that. But if you're somebody of means, somebody that is maybe working from home or still on salary, it may be a really, really good idea to, if you have a little extra, just go buy Jack's, get yourself a delicious meal for you and your family, and, drop off a little money for those families that may really be struggling right now. I think that would definitely be a worthwhile cause. Now, it is important to note in all of this that when it comes to, I think this is a great testament to how wonderful capitalism is, because when you give to charity here in America, it is often associated with eating delicious food. So, you give to charity, but you're also getting a great meal out of it. And I know that you're not giving through just buying, you're actually giving a donation on top of your purchase. But at the same time, instead of just going and giving a donation, you also get some return from that. And just to give them a little extra free plug here, I got to say, Jack's has figured out the Southern business model, which I've said this for years. If you want to be a successful restaurant in the South, you need to do one of two things. If you work in a city where there's a lot of old money like Montgomery, open up a meat and three. You open up a meat and three in Montgomery, you're golden. You just look at some of the different meat and three places that you've got around here. They're always slam packed at lunchtime. You could look at probably my favorite, Gales Down the Street Cafe, which, by the way, Russell Terry on the Fallout on Sports Radio 740, one of the co-hosts for that show, he of course is part owner and runs the place, and the food there is just always fantastic. You got Filet and Vine. There's a lot of great businesses out there that do that. You open up a meat and three somewhere in Montgomery, especially around the downtown area where there's a lot of business, and if you have adequate parking, man, you are going to get so much business from the places around. But another one that I think is a winning business model in the South is, it doesn't matter how good your restaurant is as long as you have a good breakfast. Now, that's the model that Jack's has followed. And Jack's does have a phenomenal breakfast. Those breakfast biscuits that they have, I like the bacon, egg, and cheese. They've got the 2 sausage biscuits for $2.22. It's hard to beat that deal. I went to Jack's so much for breakfast that the people at the one in Prattville back when I was living there actually learned my name, and they would go ahead and start making my order when they saw my truck pull around on Sunday mornings when I was on my way to worship. They would know, about this time he's going to be on his way to worship, and we'll go ahead and have his order ready for him. So it was just funny that they would do that, although sometimes I'd throw them off and order a steak biscuit instead if I was, had a few extra calories to spend that day. Usually I didn't. But anyway, it's a really good business. They have good burgers and lunch items too, but they've got a killer breakfast. And if you want to have a successful business anywhere in the South, have a big breakfast. That is a winning strategy for sure. Now, looking at a couple of other things that I wanted to bring up, because we've talked a lot about the numbers. And as I have done here, and this is just kind of par for the course for me, it's what I always do, is I look at things from about 10,000 feet in the air. I'm very distant from it. I want to look at the whole. I want to look at statistics. And that's important because I feel like that's part of the reason that you guys come to me, is because you have anecdotal evidence, you know people. And so I'm the one that gives you the bigger picture. But I do think that it is worth taking a little time out of our day and talking about how this is affecting people on a far more personal level. Because based on the reports that I'm hearing, a lot of it is very mixed. Because I have some people that are either were confirmed to have COVID-19 or did have it, and they were like, yeah, it was rough, but it was about like the flu. It was unpleasant, but we never felt like we were in danger or something like that. That's what I've heard from my friends and different people around. And then it's rare, but I've heard from some people that have had it and been tested and confirmed to have it, that this thing is not like the normal flu, that it was something that was very hard on them. And these are generally younger, healthy people. And they're saying, look, this thing kicked my butt. I've seen that happen multiple times throughout the past few weeks. So the way that it's affecting the average person, and by the way, that actually does kind of coincide with what we're seeing from the statistics as well, is that for the most part, people get sick and it's really not fun, just like being sick is never fun. But they don't need really any medical assistance. They kind of self-medicate at home, maybe, have to take some NyQuil to help them sleep, but by and large, it really doesn't affect their life in any meaningful way. And then all of a sudden it hits one person that just has, for whatever reason, a particular weakness to it, which can't always be accurately determined, and it really, really hurts them, and they may even have to go seek a doctor's help or even go into the hospital. And part of the reason that I wanted to discuss this today is because I have a really good friend, and she is, and I say this having known a lot of great people in the church, a lot of people who I consider to be kind. I think she's actually the kindest person I know. And I actually had this discussion once with some of my college students, because she was in my college group back when I was working with 10th Street and leading their college group there. We actually had that discussion one night, and we were like, so who is the nicest person you know? And I said, oh, it's not even a question. It's this person. And she really is one of the sweetest people I've ever met, and I'm really worried about her because she believes that she has the virus. Maybe it's something else, but she believes that she has it. She's gone and gotten tested, hasn't seen her results yet. And she's just really kind of scared, like a lot of us would be, because she has had trouble sleeping. She hasn't been able to breathe, and believe me, that's something I relate to. Because for those of you who've watched the program for a while, you may remember that back when I did have testicular cancer, right near the tail end of that in my last round of chemo, I also developed really bad PE blood clots in my lungs. And I got to tell you, I'm somebody that is usually pretty calm, doesn't freak out about things. I usually have a very level head on my shoulders. But it was kind of frightening to not be able to breathe really well. Because with other things, if it's, for example, a busted arm or a busted leg or even back pain or something like that, usually there's a way that you can either lay down in a certain position or stay off of your leg for a few days, something like that. You can't do that with your lungs. Like if you just stop breathing, you stop living. And so it becomes much scarier when something's wrong with your lungs, because you feel like if you stop breathing for too long, of course, you know that you're not going to be able to make it. And luckily, that's not the case for the vast majority of people. But it's much scarier with that, because you know if all of a sudden your lungs just seize up, it's only going to be about 2 minutes until they're not able to help you anymore. And then, because of that, you want to be a little extra cautious. And that's the reason that this thing can be very, very scary, especially for people that have never had lung problems in the past. So I also wanted people to understand this is important, because this is somebody just like you would know, somebody that goes to church. And like I said, she's one of the nicest people, one of the kindest, most genuinely kind people that I know, uses a lot of her spare time helping out the homeless and working for charities. And I mean, just an incredible person, somebody that honestly in a lot of ways I want to emulate. And she's only in her late 20s. And I see so many young people, because of my other job, because I work with college students. I've seen so many young people over the past few days just straight up ignore this thing because they feel like they're basically invincible. And that's really sad to see because they're not. And it's not just my friend who is having a lot of issues with this, despite the fact that she's actually younger than I am. But there are other people that are in a similar boat. The Atlantic actually recently released an article by an internal medicine doctor from New York City named Carrie Meltzer. I believe is the way to say her name. Meltzer, yeah. So she said that the other night she was working with different patients that had been confirmed to have the virus. And out of the 6 that she worked with that night that were specifically dealing with the Wuhan flu, 5 out of the 6 were under the age of 40. So they were in that 20 to 40 range that she was talking about. That really is astounding when you consider, because there's so many more people of that age group that are getting it because they feel like they're invincible. They feel like they don't have to self-quarantine and stay away from other people because they're not as at risk as other people. There's a couple of reasons why that's a bad attitude to have. First of all, because no matter how young you are, you're not invincible. I mean, look at me. I'm a 30-year-old cancer survivor. I understand that just because the odds are not, you're not likely to get something doesn't mean you're not going to get it. So that being said, when it comes to this, it just astounds me that young people are so cavalierly not concerned about it for themselves, but also because of the other people that they're with. I mean, maybe you're not an at-risk person, but if nothing else, you should do the best that you can to flatten this curve and try to stay in one place to try to stave this thing off at least as long as possible so that you are less likely to either pass it on to a more elderly person or somebody like me that does have a risk factor, or, and this would be another factor to consider, that even if you're not the one that actually gets sick or spreads it, at least not in the early stages, having everybody put that off allows for more hospitals to pay more attention to patients that might be older that are at risk, so we don't turn into Italy where if you're over 60, don't even bother coming into the hospital, you're on your own. And that's how you avoid a situation like that. So just today, a 25-year-old pharmacy tech from Los Angeles, this man died despite the fact that he was 25 years old from complications that came with the coronavirus. And what's even more astounding, because I figured, okay, surely this guy is a smoker or somebody that had asthma as a kid or something that complicated this. According to his doctors, despite the fact that this man was very healthy and 25 years old when he got the virus, he had no underlying health conditions and yet still died. So yes, it is unlikely that you are going to die from this thing if you are a younger person, but it is still possible, and you should treat it with caution, if not only for yourself, for people around you that are at higher risk. Because you staying out of the healthcare facilities when they are needed, it helps, again, like we've seen in so many models, flatten that curve so that other people can make use of those facilities when they really need them, and that's going to help in a lot of ways in flattening this curve to where we don't need it anymore. Earlier this week, the virus claimed a teenager in Lancaster, California. We don't have really any more details on that because the medical records are even more strict when it comes to a minor. But we do know that at least one person that was confirmed with this virus who was a teenager died in California earlier this week. At one point, 40% of all people that were hospitalized with this virus were patients between the age of 18 and 49. And a doctor, the doctor that wrote this article in The Atlantic that we were talking about a second ago, confirmed that most of her hospitalized patients are now under 40. So again, it seems to be what's happening is an awful lot of young people are the ones that are contracting this virus earlier on. Now, part of that is probably due because that's a larger portion of the population, sure. I'm sure that is part of it. But with the rates being sometimes double and triple what they are in older demographics, it is unlikely that accounts for the entirety of it. It is more likely that what is going on is that younger people are just being less cautious and are probably doing a lot of things that are putting themselves in unnecessary risk. Because, yes, the fatality rates are higher the older you get, but the fatality rates for almost anything are higher the older you get. I mean, just about any disease or sickness that you can get, the fatality rates are almost always higher for older individuals. Now, granted, that seems to be especially true with this one. But I say this to say to younger people that may be watching, and I know that my audience tends to be younger than audiences of other political talk shows. Just remember that you're not invincible, and be serious about this and take some steps to try to protect yourself and your family by staying in place, adhering to the guidelines that the government is giving. And keep in mind, as a libertarian person, that's not an easy thing for me to say, is to, as a general rule, adhere to the guidelines that the government is giving you. But really, it is something that is helpful in this one particular situation. And speaking of this, you may recall that I want to say it was about a week ago, we did a Daily Dose of Stupid on the spring breakers that were going down to Miami to party for spring break, despite the fact that the virus was going out. And you may recall that we did a video from CBS News of different kids saying that, if I get the virus, I get the virus. It's not going to stop me from partying, that kind of thing. Well, the one that appeared first in that video actually came out and apologized, which I thought was a pretty interesting news story. He apologized on Instagram, so we'll go ahead and bring that graphic up really quickly, because I think it's certainly worth taking a second look at. So Brady Solder, who is the person who was on that video, appeared on CBS News. He said, "I've done a lot of things in my life I'm not proud of. I failed, I've let down, and I've made plenty of mistakes. I can't apologize enough for the people I've offended and the lives that I've insulted. I'm not asking for your forgiveness or pity. I want to use this as a motivation to become a better person, a better son, a better friend, and a better citizen. Listen to your communities and do as health officials say. Life is precious. Don't be arrogant and think you're invincible, like myself. I learned from these trying times, and I've felt the repercussions to the fullest. Unfortunately, simply apologizing doesn't justify my behavior. I'm simply owning up to my mistakes and taking full responsibility for my actions. Thank you for your time, and stay safe, everyone." Now, a couple things in this. First of all, I think that was something that took a decent amount of maturity, which, of course, it was apparent he was severely lacking in that video when we covered it, and him basically just saying, hey, if I get the virus, I get the virus, whatever. I'm just not going to listen to it. I've been planning this trip for like 2 or 3 months, which I know is an eternity when you're 18, 19 years old. That feels like forever. But I think that it's A, possible that this was a real growth experience for him. And B, it's also possible that, like many people that are much older than he is, we have moments where we're selfish and immature, and then moments where our good sense kicks in and we suddenly become more mature, despite the fact that we are, we have moments where we say dumb things. That happens. And this is especially true of somebody that's 18, 19, or 20. I mean, I'm not trying to castigate everybody in that age group as irresponsible or dumb, because you remember I even said that when that played out and when we did the original segment. But here's what I don't want to happen. I don't want people to refuse to forgive this person, to not change their mind about him. And it's a shame that the original story has gotten so much more press and so much more discussion than the follow-up to it, which is this. I think that he shows a lot of maturity in admitting that he was wrong, apologizing, and being a voice to say, hey, I screwed up. Don't be like me. Do what the doctors and the health experts are telling you to do. I think that that's a really smart thing to do. I commend him for doing this, and I think that as Christians, this is a good opportunity for us to exercise a little grace. Because he said he was wrong, he admitted his mistake, and, he's seemingly trying to repent of that. So obviously it would be the Christian thing to do for us to forgive him and remember that, when we were 20, we probably did something equally as dumb. Maybe, maybe not. I don't know. But either way, a little bit of grace goes a long way here. And one of the things that I despise about cancel culture is that it feels as though once these people have done this unforgivable thing, whatever it may be, even if it's something as stupid as saying a tweet that was just perceived as racist, or something that was perceived, for example, as hateful or homophobic 20 or 30 years ago, something ridiculous like that. And I'm not going to go into the merits of each of the individual stories because that's not really what we're talking about. But one thing that bugs me about that cancel culture is we act as though like, nope, any response that they give to it, anything that they say afterward, we must disregard that. They are now forever banished from polite society. A little bit of grace goes a long way here because I think based on this guy's response, he is genuine. He really has learned something. And because of that, the Christian attitude, just like when Peter was asking Jesus, how many times should we forgive somebody? The same attitude of not 7 times, but 70 times 7. In other words, unlimited, always trying to give people the benefit of the doubt. That would go a really long way here. This kid, he got some notoriety from this. And by the way, it was deserved because what he did was dumb. But I don't think this should ruin the kid's life just because he made a stupid comment. And especially when you consider that he came back and apologized for it. And so I really do think that as Christian people, extending as much grace as we would like to be given from our Savior is a good policy, a good rule of thumb to follow here. So what's on the horizon for us as a state and as people? I expect this week we will probably peak. This week, next week, maybe. Now, I get that I'm not a medical expert, and I get that there's people that have different projections. Some people thought that we should have already peaked. Some people thought that we were going to peak much later. Some people, I've even heard that there was a university, again, because I'm working for Faulkner here in Montgomery, I hear some things from other universities, that there was one other Christian university that they're projecting their peak to not hit until July in Tennessee. Now, I tend to not think that that's true because, A, there's been a lot of data that seems to suggest that this thing is just another seasonal flu, that it is much harder to transfer from person to person when the weather gets hot and humid, and especially considering they're in Tennessee, well, there's a good chance that that's not going to happen and you're not going to wind up peaking at sometime like in July. But, it's a possibility. I tend to think that we're going to peak either sometime late this week, early next week. And because of that, there's going to be a lot of people that are understandably nervous. They're going to see some numbers that are really frightening to them. And that's understandable. But ultimately, I think that this is a good time to pray for preparing ourselves. It's really common in the scripture that people would pray for strength ahead of time. And I think that this has probably always been a problem because it's a human problem. And I think there's even examples of this in the scripture, of people not praying to God until after they're already in trouble and realize how much they need him. Now, understanding how much you need God's blessing and coming to that realization can be really good for you in some ways. But I think that it makes more sense and it shows a lot more spiritual maturity to try to pray ahead of things like this happening. Look, we see this thing coming. Whether we peak next week or sometime later, this is going to be something that is going to try us, that's going to test us, and we can see ahead of time that this is probably going to get a lot worse before it gets better. Which means, and I think that this is the case, that it would be wise of God's people to go ahead and pray for strength for the upcoming events as well. To steel our hearts, to make ourselves ready to endure something that's going to hit us probably pretty hard. So maybe this week what we should do is focus on that. Maybe even add in a little fasting. I mean, goodness knows, since we're having some, it's risky to go out and get food now, amazingly, to think as strange as that is in the United States of America. Maybe this is a good opportunity to even do that a little bit. Maybe fast a little in preparation for what's coming, spiritually ready ourselves. That might not be a bad way to go. So maybe that should be the focus of you and your family for the next week, is just getting ready for the really bad stuff to hit really soon. and preparing yourselves not so much physically, even though that's important too, making sure you have supplies in the house, that kind of thing, but more so spiritually, being ready for your spirit to take on the challenges that are coming your way. So what we'll do is we'll take a quick break here and we'll come back in just a minute on tactics.
Hey, where you going? Champ? Slugger? Hey, cowboy. Where you going? Where you going?
I'm going out!
Hey everybody, heading south on I-65 between Huntsville and Birmingham, and a thought struck me. I was reading the other night from the Gospel of Matthew, the story where Jesus walks on the water and then Peter requests that Christ let him come out on the water too, and to come towards him. And it's a story that I'm sure most of us are familiar with. The Apostle Peter steps out onto the water, a very bold thing to do, and then all of a sudden he starts getting distracted by the storm that is going on. There's wind, there's waves, there's rain, and he starts looking to the right and the left and seeing how turbulent the sea is, and he takes his eyes off of Christ, and immediately he starts sinking into the water. And I think that says a lot about the way that we're supposed to look at Christ in our life. Everybody has storms. I don't care who you are. I don't care what kind of life that you live, whether you're rich or you're poor, you live in the country, you live in the city, whether you've got a lot of family, whether you have virtually no family. Everybody's got storms. Everybody has things in their life that just don't go their way. Things that they have to deal with, whether it's money, whether it's sickness. Something happens to everybody on a pretty regular basis. And I think that where we start going wrong, where we start sinking, is when we start focusing on the waves, we start focusing on the rain, we start focusing on the storms in our life, rather than looking forward at Christ. Now, Peter already knew that the sea was stormy. He was in a boat. He was very aware of the fact that the storm was raging pretty heavy at that point. So, what happened? He started out right. And then when he stopped focusing on Christ and started focusing on the terrible things going on around him, when he started focusing on them and that became the focus, he became afraid and he started sinking. And that's kind of like driving in a lot of ways. If you focus too much on the storm, if you focus on what's going on around you, if you focus too much on the other cars or start looking behind you and worrying about that, then you're going to lose focus on your goal, and you're either going to go in the wrong direction or, unfortunately, much worse, you wind up wrecking. That's obviously not good. And so, just like Peter, I think that the point of that story is that we have to keep our eyes constantly focused on Christ. Are we aware of the storm? Sure. Do we do the best that we can to deal with the circumstances of our life? Absolutely. That's something that the Bible really helps us with. But there's a difference in being aware of the storm and doing something to deal with the storm and focusing on the storm. We focus on Christ. And if we focus on Christ, we have faith in Him that, yes, the storm is there. Yes, we know it's there. But that whatever the storm happens to throw at us, it'll be okay because our focus is on Christ. It's a question of our priorities, and it's also a question of, do you trust God enough to bring you through the storm? And if the answer is yes, then all we have to do is look at Christ, keep ourselves focused on Him, and walk straight ahead. And that is going to be a much better way to live than constantly worrying about whatever new wave or whatever new rain or whatever new wind shows up in our life. Keep our eyes focused on Christ and walking forward so that one day we reach Him.
That was stupid.
I know it was stupid.
Really stupid.
Hey, I just said it was stupid.
And for today's Daily Dose of Stupid, everybody is freaking out over a representative from Kentucky, Thomas Massie, who wanted to call for a roll call vote the other day for the $2 trillion stimulus package, which I believe was incredibly stupid, both on the part of the American people, and we'll get into some specific people that were dealing with this. So first of all, Representative Massie The guy is a member of the Freedom Caucus. He's a constitutionalist. He always, basically filters everything through the question of, okay, is this constitutional? So he wanted a roll call vote on the stimulus package because based on what he was hearing, they were not going to call for roll call, which he wanted some accountability, people to actually be on the roll as having voted either in favor of it or against it. The second part of that, because this is where putting on my parliamentarian hat is actually helpful, the fact that I'm a certified parliamentarian. So the way that works is you need this thing called quorum, which means you have a certain number, the organization actually decides the number themselves, of people that are the minimum amount of people gathered to conduct business. Now, the reason this is important is because it keeps people from, for example, it keeps them from getting to the point to where they could just have a handful of members that they know are going to vote for something that they want, and just getting those people together, even though they're a tiny percentage of the overall organization, and just pass stuff, and it's now a part of the organization, or in this case, a part of law, without a majority or even a plurality of the body being gathered together to constitute a quorum to exercise that business and to be able to do it. So that's what it's trying to prevent. And what you have when there is an absence of significant opposition to a bill is you have a vote count called general consent. So the way a general consent vote counts is basically you go, okay, we're going to go ahead and vote on, Bill X or whatever. Is there any opposition to this bill? And then nobody calls it. Okay, then by general consent it passes because there were no objections to the bill passing. So this is the sneaky way that they were going to try to get around that. What they were trying to do is, with a number that they knew full well would not be quorum, in other words, would not be the number that they would need to get to be able to pass the bill, they were going to do that, and then in conjunction with what's called a general consent vote, to where they were just going to say, hey, is anybody opposed to it? No, okay, good, we're going to go ahead and pass it, bang, gavel, everybody go home. So there's a pretty big reason why there's constitutional problems with that. First of all, when it comes to Thomas Massie and his rationale behind all of this, it's important to note, because the media kind of forgot about this when they were reporting the story, is that he announced this days before, not just to his colleagues, but also publicly on Twitter, that he was going to call for a roll call vote. So it's not like in the last second, right before the meeting started, he's like, oh, and by the way, I'm going to be calling to see if there's quorum here or not. No, he did this way beforehand, actually 2 or 3 days before this took place, which would have been plenty of time for them to make sure that they had quorum to vote on this thing. Because the thing is, even though I hate to talk about this because I didn't like the bill for a number of reasons, there's no way this thing wasn't going to pass. Like, it's one of the most bipartisan bills that we've had in recent history because of what it is intended to do. And so there was very little chance that this thing was not going to pass. I couldn't see them mounting a significant opposition to it in the first place. So they were pretty sure that this thing was going to pass regardless. And so there's no reason to be afraid of a roll call vote. It's going to keep it from passing maybe an hour, if that. Now, they were saying that it would delay it by days or months. That's not true. All you have to do is call for a vote. That's it. And if you don't have quorum, you have time to gather a quorum. That doesn't automatically kill the bill. But what they did was they waited until the last second, knowing that Thomas Massie was going to do this, and just straight up said, well, we're going to ignore it. Now, they had 3 or 4 days to gather a quorum and to actually have a roll call vote. They just refused to do it. And to illustrate why this is a fair criticism, remember that 96 out of the 100 senators showed up in order to pass this thing. They got quorum and got it by a wide margin. They only had to have a majority. They got 96. That's way over a majority. All they needed were 51 and they got 96. So the senators, with the exception of Rand Paul, who actually has coronavirus, and Ted Cruz, or not Ted Cruz, Mike Lee and a couple of other senators that had come in contact with him and because of that decided to stay at home for fear of spreading it to other people. 96 of the senators showed up and did this ahead of time. They did their jobs. They did what their constitutional duty and oath of office demands that they do. And that's another thing that people seem to forget when they were talking about this, and there were a lot of people that were mad at me for even defending the guy. That this is in the Constitution. It's not as though this is something that he just pulled out of nowhere. It's not as though this was a parliamentary trick that he sort of, bubbled up in the 11th hour. It's not like this is a filibuster or something. This is something that has been in our Constitution since the very beginning. So you'll look here. This is from Section 5, Article 1, Section 5. Right, just need to clarify for people because my lawyer buddies will get upset with me if I say it wrong. Article 1, Section 5 of the Constitution. Each house shall be the judge of elections, returns, and qualifications of its own members, and a majority of each shall constitute a quorum to do business. Now, there's a couple of other stipulations underward, but that's the part that we're concerned with, that you need a majority of each house. In other words, in the Senate, there are 50 states, 2 senators per state. You have to have 51. That's a pretty simple majority. You have to have at least 51 senators gathered to be able to conduct business. With the House of Representatives, I don't remember, and I don't want to do the math in my head right now and embarrass myself live on air. It's, a little bit north of 260, something like that. So you have to have 50% plus 1 to equal a majority. And they basically just refused to do this, even though it's in the Constitution. What they passed was illegal. And Thomas Massie actually had a conversation with the House parliamentarian about this. And he said, so I'm going to call for a roll call vote. They're probably going to ignore me, so I'm going to call to check if we have quorum, which each member of the House of Representatives has a right to do that. And if they doubt that there's a quorum, they should do that, regardless of what the bill is that they're talking about. So he called for quorum, and basically the speaker looked around and said, yeah, there's a quorum here, knowing good and well there was not a quorum there. And I think the number is actually 218 now, that if memory serves. So basically they didn't check. The check took 2 seconds because Massie actually laid out exactly what happened. The speaker stood up there, either Nancy Pelosi or her representative. I'm not sure whether it was her or whether it was someone else taking the duties of the chair while she was doing this. But looked around, said, yep, quorum here. And there is no check against this somehow. The House parliamentarian actually said that according to the rules, basically their observation of whether or not there is a chairman, this is not debatable. You can't have a vote on it. It's absolute. And so they just said that there was a quorum when they knew that there wasn't. And there's a number of reasons why that this is incredibly important, because if this is ignored, the Speaker of the House then becomes the most powerful person in Washington. More powerful than the president, more powerful than the Chief Justice. The Speaker of the House then can, whenever they want to, if they know that nobody's going to check them on quorum, or they can say that a quorum is established regardless of whether or not a quorum is actually established, is they could have just a whole bunch of representatives that they know are going to vote the way that they want them to, show up, call for a vote by general consent without anybody objecting to the bill, just say that it passes by general consent, and basically one person can go ahead and pass whatever bill they want. That makes one person effectively as powerful as the entirety of the House of Representatives. And that's not a good place to be. Because the House of Representatives was always supposed to be a representative body. It's not an executive body. That's why we have an executive branch. But if this is the new standard, if the Speaker of the House now can determine that there is quorum with no blowback whatsoever, regardless of whether there's a quorum or not, Nancy Pelosi can pass just about whatever she wants to. And that's why this is so incredibly dangerous, especially when you consider the thing that they passed using this process was the single largest spending bill in American history. And if you combine the $2 trillion that they agreed to spend on here and the $4 trillion that they're going to use to bail out the banks, that's a total of $6 trillion. That's larger than our annual budget, We just spent more than our annual budget, which is already putting us in debt, by the way, which we're already spending more money every single year than we take in from taxes. We just spent more than that in one day. I get that it's an emergency. I get that we had to do something. I get that this is an important thing to do. But you really want not only that to take place, but you want it to take place by using a process that was unconstitutional? See, because if a member of the Supreme Court were to take this up, and I know that that would take a really long time, but theoretically, if a member of the Supreme Court were to take this up, they would say, no, that stimulus bill is unconstitutional. It doesn't pass constitutional muster because they did not establish quorum before they did so. It's important that you follow the rules, even more important in an emergency than normal. Because in an emergency, governments tend to take and seize power, and they tend to not give it back. And we're going to do a whole special on this probably tomorrow. I've been working on it for a few days now, trying to get it all organized and everything, and it's not ready for prime time yet, which is the reason I haven't rolled it out yet. But suffice it to say that if they can do this, then especially on something that is the largest spending bill in American history, then Nancy Pelosi can pass pretty much whatever she wants to without the consent of the rest of the House of Representatives. That ought to be a thought that terrifies everybody. And unfortunately, and this is the second part of the Daily Dose of Stupid, President Trump jumped all over him without all of the information or without fully understanding what was going on, which, let's be honest, is kind of Trump's MO. So this is President Trump earlier tweeting about Thomas Massie. Looks like third-rate grandstander named Thomas Massie, a congressman from, unfortunately, a truly great state, Kentucky, wants to vote against the new Save Our Workers bill in Congress. He just wants the publicity. He can't stop it, only delay, which is both dangerous and costly. Workers and small businesses need money now in order to survive. Virus wasn't their fault. It is, word I can't repeat, dealing with Dems had to give up in some stupid things in order to get the big picture done. 90%, great win, back house, but throw Massie out of the Republican Party. So, this is dumb on a number of levels. Virtually everything that Trump put in that tweet, and again, I know this is par for the course for Trump's Twitter feed. Virtually everything he said there was completely wrong. First of all, the grandstander thing is just stupid. Now, the last person that I can think of, at least off the top of my head, that the president referred to as a grandstander was Mitt Romney. Now, you have to remember the reaction to Mitt Romney when it came to the whole impeachment kerfuffle. Mitt Romney was welcomed with open arms by both the media and the Democrat Party, hailed as a hero. Everybody wanted to lift him up on their shoulders. So I don't know that publicity really was his motivation. I think that Mitt Romney's, frankly, just kind of not all that bright. But anyway, you could make the case there that the reason that Romney was doing that was to ingratiate himself to the left in the media by doing the only thing that they really care about, and that is dumping on President Trump. So when President Trump called Mitt Romney a grandstander, well, that makes sense. Nobody liked that Thomas Massie did this. Not the Republicans, not the Democrats. I mean, he knew that President Trump, I don't think he knew that President Trump was going to tweet directly about him, but he knew that President Trump wasn't going to be happy with him. He knew that the vast majority of his Republican colleagues were not going to be happy with him, and he knew that there were probably an awful lot of his constituents that were not going to be happy with him, and that he was going to face probably a pretty decent primary opponent and have a very uphill battle if he did this. So the idea that he did this to be popular is just stupid. I don't know how the president got that out of, maybe he was trying to compare it to Romney, I don't know, but if he was, that was a dumb comparison because the media they were not kind to Massie because of this. The Republicans nor the Democrats, there's like 10 people, including myself, that thought Thomas Massie actually did the right thing here. So the idea that he did this to be popular is just dumb. And the president, I mean, really should have the good sense to understand that. Another claim that Trump makes in this tweet is that he couldn't stop it. He was only delaying it, which is probably true. But he acted as though, and this was the narrative that the media, both on the right and the left, were running with Thomas Massie. They were making the case essentially that he was just trying to delay it. Well, no, like I said, he gave warning about 3 or 4 days in advance. What that means is they knew ahead of time. He wasn't saying it to delay. If he did it simply to delay the bill, he would have not announced it to anybody, waited until the last second, and then tried to pull that stunt from the floor. He didn't do that. He told people several days ahead of time so they could get ready to have a quorum to do that. And so it's just absurd to say that he was doing this for the sake of delaying. Now, would it have effectively delayed the bill? Maybe for a few hours, at most a day, if that, and I doubt that, to be perfectly honest. But if they had just listened to Massie ahead of time, a couple of days beforehand, when he said, oh, I'm going to do this, be aware of it, be ready, then it wouldn't have delayed the bill by any more than an hour, for sure, because everybody that they needed to have quorum would have been there and it would have passed. So the idea that he was trying to delay it, which is what Trump implied, is incorrect. Also, this one is not incorrect in the sense that it's factually accurate, but it's a dumb argument to make when you were the side trying to say, hey, let's go ahead and spend $6 trillion. Like when you say, oh, it's so costly. Well, you're voting on a bill to spend more than our annual federal budget in less than 24 hours. And you're going to preach to me about being fiscally conservative. That the plane and the plane fares and the hotel bills that Congress was going to spend getting a quorum there, that was going to be more expensive than the $6 trillion you just wanted to spend. I'm sorry, don't talk to me about it being too expensive when you're the one in favor of that. Like that's a really dumb argument to make when you're on the let's spend $6 trillion side of this thing. Another one, it's unsafe. This is, again, like the costly bill, one that is technically has some truth to it. However, I do find it a little bit elitist for a bunch of Congress people to say, no, you don't understand. It's just not safe for us to go there and establish a quorum and be in Washington for us to take this vote. Yeah, but you're saying to all of the truck drivers, you guys still need to be out there and putting yourselves in harm's way. You're saying to all of our first responders and healthcare workers, you guys need to be out there making sure that everything's okay. You're saying that to our grocers. You're saying that to an awful lot of working American people. But when it comes to you, oh no, it's unsafe. We can't go in. We can't do that. We can't be around other people for an hour, even though we can be 6 feet apart from each other in the house, even if we establish a quorum. Yeah, we're not doing that. That's just too unsafe. What a bunch of arrogant, that's a load of horse crap right there. It's the nicest way I can say it. Like the average American person, hardworking people that are trying to keep our shelves stored and trying to make sure that there's food for Americans and take care of us in this healthcare crisis. It's okay to put their lives at risk, but you don't understand. We're congressmen. We're just too important to be risking ourselves out there meeting with a bunch of people in Congress. Shut the crap up. I don't even want to deal with that. And then another thing, and this was the strangest thing in President Trump's tweet at the end, where he was talking about how the Democrats had to give some stuff up. Yeah, but the Democrats' starting point was give us everything that we want. And the give us everything that we want thing included things like extra money to Planned Parenthood and, I don't know, a whole bunch of stuff that included like the enforcement of the Green New Deal and things like just basically unlimited unemployment. I mean, there was just a laundry list of things that Democrats have been fighting for forever. Universal basic income that they were going to stuff into this thing. And they had to give up some of it. But considering their starting point was $2.6 trillion and our starting point was, I think, 1.2, we got an awful lot closer to their goal than ours. I would not call that a 90% win, as the president tried to cast it. That's definitely not where it was. I mean, the increased bargaining rights, because that's what everyone's complaining about, right? Is that unions just aren't strong enough. And that's the problem that we're having. That's been a Democrat wish list for a long time that they did get into this bill. And again, we'll talk more about that tomorrow. But it's a really odd thing that the president is praising this bill and saying that we got 90% of what we wanted. Well, maybe if that's 90% of what Trump wants, then his values are way, way different than mine. But anyway, and then he issued this next tweet a little bit later, which frankly is equally bad. Let's go ahead and look at this Trump tweet about Thomas Massie. By empowering the radical left Democrats, do-nothing Kentucky politician Thomas Massie is making their war on the Second Amendment more and more difficult to win. But don't worry, we will win anyway. He is a disaster for America and for the great state of Kentucky. So, again, Thomas Massie being the lightning rod of Donald Trump's ire and saying that this somehow endangers the Second Amendment. Look, if anything, this makes it harder for Nancy Pelosi to get her agenda through for the reasons that we've already listed, that she can't just unilaterally with herself say, yep, we've got a quorum here, and by the way, is there any objection to this bill? Nope, it passes. Okay, let's move on. I mean, theoretically, if the rules of quorum just don't matter anymore, then she could do that and just pass massive sweeping gun legislation. Now, she would still need the consent of the Senate and the consent of the president to do that. But what I'm saying is, this actually, what Thomas Massie is suggesting by making sure that we have quorum before we call votes, actually acts as an obstacle and a check on Nancy Pelosi's power and would make it more difficult for the House, which right now is the only portion of the federal government that is controlled by the Democrats, to be able to get legislation through. So it's actually the exact opposite of what Donald Trump just said. Now, I don't know why he decided it was important to throw the Second Amendment in there. It seems kind of off topic and not in any way related to what we're talking about. But even if you ignore that, even if you're trying to follow the president's logic on this one, he got it literally backwards from the way it's supposed to be, or from the truth, that it would actually make it far more difficult to curtail the Second Amendment as Democrats if this were the case. Now, ultimately, I think that this goes down to a character flaw that the president has and has had for a very, very long time. This is not a new thing. President Trump has always been this way. And unfortunately, part of the reason I believe that he communicates so well with the vast majority of the American people is specifically because they have this exact same mentality and he understands it and even articulates it. The president only sees people in exactly one way or another. They are either allies or they are enemies, and there is no middle ground. There is not just somebody who is an occasional ally. There is not somebody who's not really an ally, but sometimes they do things that he agrees with. There's nobody that's neutral. Every single person in the eyes of our president is either an ally or an enemy, and there is no in between. And if you're an ally, you're the greatest person ever. You're wonderful. He won't be able to stop praising you. And if you're an enemy, the exact opposite. You're the worst person that has ever existed, and you should be castrated and thrown into a pit of lions. Like, that's basically the president's outlook on every human being that he comes across. And I think that because human beings just tend to not do nuance real well, it's the same thing, because you'll see, as I talked about earlier with Tom Massie, he sees Tom Massie and Mitt Romney as exactly the same. That doesn't make any sense if you're looking at the facts or the circumstances surrounding it. It makes perfect sense if you're seeing it the way that the president sees things, which is everybody is either my enemy or my ally, and there is no in between. And you will see that the president is at least he will switch that category from time to time. You know, Mitt Romney can be an ally and then an enemy, and you can have people that used to be allies like Jeff Sessions that are now enemies. And there are people that used to be enemies that are now allies. Like, this is something that the president does on a fairly regular basis. But the point is, there's still only two categories. And he treats everybody within those two large categories exactly the same and doesn't see any difference between them. That's because he sees himself as the center of the universe. Basically, the universe revolves around him. And because of that, everybody, the way that he needs to see them is, how does that person relate to me? That's how he sees everyone. And to him, outside factors, the constitutionality or something, those things really don't matter, because the only thing that actually matters is, does that person see him as an ally or an enemy? See, because he believes that the world is just divided up into those two categories, he thinks everyone else thinks like him, which is a tendency that humans have to do. We tend to think other people see the world the way that we see it. It's a really selfish mindset to have, and unfortunately I've seen an awful lot of it on the right and the left. I know an awful lot of people on the right that they are only able to see people as either allies or enemies politically, and they don't understand any nuance whatsoever. And I get that it takes a lot of studying and a lot of time to be able to understand some of those subtle nuances. Sometimes Rand Paul says something that is a little too isolationist that I think is a dumb idea. Doesn't mean I think the guy is my enemy just because he happens to disagree with me on one issue. Most of the time I wind up agreeing with Rand Paul. The same thing could be said with really anybody in Congress. Occasionally they'll do some things I disagree with, but that doesn't automatically make them my enemy. And even if somebody that is my political enemy, somebody like Bernie Sanders or Chuck Schumer or Nancy Pelosi, it's rare, but occasionally they do something that makes sense, and I commend them for it. And just bringing this subject up over the past few days, it has really shown me a lot of the friends that have exactly the same mindset as the president, which is, if you were saying anything negative about Donald Trump, you must be my political enemy. If you say something that is positive about him, and I'm on the other side, you must be my political enemy, and then they treat you that way. I don't know what it is, but for whatever reason, we have come to a place in our political standings that we're so toxic that we just section ourselves off into our tribes, and anybody that is not a member of our tribe, we have to destroy them. It's not a healthy way to look at things. And I think that it has done an awful lot to break us apart as a country when we really need to be coming together, especially right now. You see, ultimately, it becomes more important to remember these rules and to do things the right way, like Thomas Massey was talking about, in a crisis, than ever before. Because it is in times of crisis that governments tend to take over and seize liberties. Thomas Massey was trying to keep that from happening. Even if you disagree with how he did it, or even if you disagree with him doing it at this moment, that's where he was coming from. And I think that you need to keep that in mind. He wasn't doing it out of malice. He wasn't doing it because he wanted to grandstand, certainly. The only reason he was doing it is because he thought it was the right thing to do. And I have a hard time faulting somebody for that. Like, even if I disagree with what their observation of the right thing to do is, at least I understand that there was not malicious intent there. And with Massey, he actually was trying to do the right thing. And something that really sets a better precedent for later. Because if anytime there's a crisis, the Speaker of the House essentially becomes the entirety of the House of Representatives and can do what they want, that's a very dangerous precedent to have. And people that are critical of him for doing that need to keep that in mind. Let's go to the Chaplain's Report.
In 1775, the Continental Congress created the Chaplain Corps. Under the command of General George Washington, each soldier was required to attend worship service every Sunday. While other armies advanced on their feet, Washington's troops advanced on their knees. It's time for the Chaplain's Report with Caleb Colquitt on tactics.
As I have mentioned a few times over the past few broadcasts, I've recently been going through the book of Judges, and I came across a story recently that I guess I had forgotten some of the details of it, and it's only in a couple chapters in the Bible, and it's never mentioned again, or at least not that I can recall, maybe in reference sometime in Chronicles or something like that. But it's a story about a Levite and his wife. So without going too much into detail, he and his wife are traveling, and they stop by in a town, and through hospitality of a stranger in this town, which is a town occupied by Benjamites, people of the tribe of Benjamin, they actually take him into this town, And in the middle of the night, you see a scenario that's very similar to what happened in Sodom with Lot. That all of a sudden you have men in the middle of the night banging on this person's door, saying that they would like him to send out the stranger, send out the person that is lodging in his house that they saw go into his house earlier, so that they can, and this is uncomfortable, and I know I usually do a family-friendly show, but this one, if you've got kids, you may want to steer away from this one for right now. The way that this story goes is that the men were banging on his door and asking him to send out the man that was lodging with him so that they could rape him. And that was the reason that they wanted him to come out. The Bible is subtle in this language, but it's still clear that that was the intent by the Hebrew verbiage that is used in that story. It's actually the same as the one that is used in Sodom and Gomorrah, where they ask Lot to send out the angels, the strangers that came to visit him. They didn't know they were angels at the time, to have their way sexually with them. So this is a really, really horrible thing, because it's not just homosexuality, but it would be even worse, forced homosexuality. So you've got the homosexual sin, but then also, and more importantly, you have the sin of raping somebody without their consent going along with this. And it's important to understand the culture in which this took place. Sadly, even though this would have very clearly been a violation of the law of Moses, and it would have been something that would have been horrible for you to do to a stranger, because the morality of it would have still been wrong. In their culture, it wouldn't have necessarily been something that would be considered wrong. Because back then, even though the law of Moses had come, and they should have known better by this point, all the society surrounding Israel, their morality was, it's wrong to do anything untoward or sexually immoral towards anybody in our tribe. Anybody else is basically fair game. And you see this same sort of mentality reflected in Sodom that you also see reflected here in this story with the Benjamite, that once a foreigner comes into town, all right, well, it's okay to do whatever we want to with those guys. You're not allowed to do that to anybody within the city or within the tribe, but somebody comes from out of town, then yeah, have your way with them. That's really the way that societies surrounding Israel at this time would have thought. And unfortunately, despite the fact that this city is a city where Benjamites, children of Israel themselves that should have known the law of Moses, dwelled, they had a similar mentality. So what happens is they instead, and this is an incredibly cowardly thing to do, they offer up his wife instead of him for them to have their way with sexually. They refuse, but they wind up sending her out anyway, and they not only rape the woman, but rape her to death. And she is found dead the next day on the threshold of the door of the man that took the Levite, the travelers, in for the evening. So, I mean, a really gruesome story, and when the Levite, the priest, sees that she is dead, he does something symbolic, but still, I think, pretty, grotesque and really makes you cringe, even though it's a story in the Bible. He actually cuts her body up into 12 pieces, her already dead body. And that represents the 12 tribes of Israel, and he scatters them all over the kingdom. And you'll see the reason that he did that was basically to get everybody's attention. To say to everybody, hey, this is pretty serious. And when they look at this, they say, why would someone do that? And then he explains the backstory, what happened with him and how he was abused and how his wife was killed because of the children of Israel, because of the Benjamites that did this to him. So it's a really, really gross and grotesque opening to the story, and we'll see that this is how the reaction goes for this. If I can go ahead and pull up, this is in Judges 20, 12 through 14. So he says, Then the tribes of Israel sent men through the entire tribe of Benjamin, saying, What is this wickedness that has taken place among you? Now then, deliver the men up, the worthless fellows in Gibeah, that's the name of the city they were in, that we may put them to death and remove this wickedness from Israel. But the sons of Benjamin would not listen to the voices of their brothers, the sons of Israel. The sons of Benjamin gathered from the cities to Gibeah, and to go out to do battle against the sons of Israel. Now, this is really interesting for a couple of reasons. First of all, you see an actual civil war take place because of this wickedness that was done to one person. And I think that this is a warning that our sins, though not necessarily extreme as this in many cases, it can cause rifts between people who are supposed to be family, supposed to be either actual flesh and blood family or brothers and sisters in Christ, or just our fellow human beings. It can cause problems within them and can have nearly irrevocable consequences for the actions that we take. But I think what's even more significant about this is that if you understand the cultural context in which I just laid out, that if this had happened to a foreigner traveling in a foreign land, it would not have been seen as something that was necessarily immoral. There would have been maybe other people from that person's tribe that were mad about it. But ultimately, the tribe itself, the surrounding nation, wouldn't have punished people doing something like this because it wasn't a member of our tribe or our city, because it was somebody from outside. That's not something that played with God. You see, God of the Torah, of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and eventually the personification, God in the flesh, Jesus Christ, the thing that is so radically different about them, and the thing that was really first presented in the Torah, is the idea of a universal God that cares about everybody, that isn't tribal, and that primarily cares about morality, that primarily cares about who people are and what they do, no matter what tribe they belong to, more so than what's right for them and their tribe. See, every other God before then, he was only concerned with the people whose God he was. But the Jewish God, the true God, he's a universal God that created all people and cares about what happens to all of them. And as such, the standard of morality is the same. Everybody is held to certain, moral principles that are universal. And that's something that really the Torah was the first to present. And it also shows how incredibly serious God takes something like rape. Because a lot of scoffers and skeptics will try to say things like, well, God was just a tribal God, which we've already debunked that. And then they'll also say, well, God didn't really care much about women's rights and women's consent and that kind of thing. Not true. Because this one horrible event, and I blame in part, and I don't think this should be overshadowed either, that the rabbi, the person whose husband she was, should have never done this and took an amazing act of cowardice for him to do so, but ultimately he is still, at least in some sense, a victim of this. That what's more important is that because of evil done, the rape of one woman, Israel starts a civil war. No, God took this very seriously. And these people that rose up against the Benjamin tribe, they consulted God and the priests beforehand to see if this was something that they ought to do, and they said, yes. God has told us that this is something not through only the law of Moses, but also divine revelation to us. This is something that this is a cancer that needs to be carved out of Israel, is sort of a synopsis of what they were saying. Because in the ancient world, it may not have been a big deal, but it was a really, really big deal to God. See, the whole point of establishing the nation of Israel is so they could be different, so that they would be something that was an example to the nations around them. They weren't supposed to be like those nations. They were supposed to be God's nation and God's people who acted differently than they did. And so by doing this, they defeated their purpose. By doing this, they became just as evil and wicked as depraved as the nations around them. Yes, this was the standard for the world and the culture at this time. It was not God's standard and never was. And that was God's point in all of this. You were supposed to be a light to the other people. You were supposed to be better than them. You were supposed to show them how to be more like you, and thus, by extension, more like me. And you failed. You became just like they were. And because of that, God saw that he needed the children of Israel to punish them and to cast this wickedness off from them. Because ultimately, it's important to remember that seeing somebody brutalized and abused like this, it hurt God because she was his child too. Didn't matter that she wasn't from that city. Didn't matter that she wasn't from their tribe. Didn't matter that this was a woman that did not have the most reputable life. She was somebody that left her husband and cheated on him and did all kinds of evil things. That didn't matter. It still didn't justify the actions that they took. God still cared about what happened to her and treated her like her life was really important. And that was, unfortunately, a concept that was lost on the tribe of Benjamin at this point because they didn't think of her that way. And that's the reason they were able to abuse her the way that she did. You know, having to invoke this punishment, having to have this civil war between Benjamin and the other tribes of Israel, that hurt God, but it was worth it because it was the right thing to do. It hurt God and it hurt the other children of Israel that didn't want to go to war against their brothers. But ultimately, doing the right thing was more important than what was comfortable or what was easy. And I think that's kind of something that the story says to us too. Because this is an uncomfortable story to read, especially as a modern Christian living in America. This is something that is actually in the Bible, but if you look at the lessons inside of it, it's actually pretty profound. And I think that just like this story is uncomfortable for us, it's a story that still teaches us quite a bit. And in the same sense, in sort of a similar light, just because something is uncomfortable or countercultural for us to do in our lives today, that doesn't mean it's not the right thing to do. Sometimes, when we have to weigh, okay, is it better to be righteous or is it better to be comfortable? We got to make that determination that it's better to be righteous and do that instead of doing what always makes us comfortable. Sometimes we have to do the uncomfortable thing in order to be right. And I think that that may be the biggest lesson that comes out of this story for a modern reader that understands how wicked and depraved this behavior was. Sometimes being God's people is very uncomfortable. I'm sure it was very uncomfortable for the other 11 tribes of Israel to have to go to war against people that they considered family. But it was the right thing to do, and so they had to do it. They had to do so to be in accordance with God's will and to be on the right side of his justice. I think that ultimately it comes down to a question of worldview. Are we seeking to live a life of righteousness or comfort? Because if we're seeking comfort, we wind up being the Benjamites. If we seek out a life of righteousness, we become more like God. If I'm given that choice, I'm going to pick God every single time. Because obviously, picking comfort and picking what feels right in the moment, that doesn't lead anywhere good. Stay the course, friends. Tactics is a production of News Radio 1440 and Cumulus Media Montgomery. Opinions expressed on this program are those of the host and do not necessarily reflect the opinions of Cumulus Media or our business partners. Graphics by Jessica Dawson. Video production by Jackson Dean. Broadcast studio provided by Faulkner University. Location studio provided by the Dalraida Church of Christ.